In the 8th century AD, sat within a grand palace set within the great walled city of Damascus, an Islamic commander and recent hero sat comfortably among his countrymen. He had recently returned from adding an entire region to his caliph's control and extending the reach of Islam to a new domain and entirely new continent. As Musa ibn Nasr reflected on his conquests, he looked back on how his family had gone from near slavery to governors of a large North African territory and conquerors of Spain. Facing armies and cultures Islam had yet to encounter in its short rise to power. A man in his position should have had the world at his feet. Few men could compare to his achievements. But an uneasy feeling had rested within Musa's heart for weeks now, a feeling he could not yet diagnose. He sat reading from his long scrolls of scripture and reflected on his travels across the world. As he glanced up from his reading, the eyes of Suleiman stared back from across the dimly lit hall. Recently rising to caliph, Suleiman ibn Abdul Malik was the most powerful man in the Arab world and was making several moves to secure his power base. Suleiman made a loose gesture with his hands, prompting movement all around him. The great doors of the hall were slowly opened and a line of dignitaries and messengers entered. Musa, still seated and still wearing the gaze of Suleiman, was beckoned towards the caliph. As he approached, he glanced towards the commotion flowing into the room. Among this trail of men were boxes of gold, fine gems and pieces of furniture being carried in from all corners of the world to see if they met the great Suleiman's taste. Suleiman instead was transfixed by another object. An olive wood and ivory box was placed on a table between the men. Musa, having seen such ceremonies many times, approached the table. The great Caliph Suleiman gestured for him to open the box with a casual flick of his head, his eyes still transfixed on Musa ibn Nasr. As Musa lay his hands on the box and carefully lifted the lid, more eyes yet bore into him. "Do you recognize it?" Suleiman asked scornfully, as Musa stared helplessly into the product of his life's work. His family had shared the same hue and glint to their eyes for generations. Now he looked into them once again. Musa closed the box as casually as his trembling hands could manage, responding simply to Suleiman that he recognized it as belonging to a man that had always practiced the faith fervently and with a true dedication to God, and that he cursed all those who took part in such an act. Suleiman still stared back, his eyes daring Musa to draw his weapon. Musa ibn Nasr took one last look into the eyes within the head of his decapitated son before turning his back, the last time he would ever look into either of his son's eyes. The family that changed history was nevertheless caught in the ever-turning wheels of time. Those who become trapped underneath, crushed by the weight of more ambitious, brutal men. Musa and his sons were just the latest to run out of time in a brutal game of ambition. Hello and welcome to the Embers of the Past. Today we shall be exploring how an early Islamic army was within 200 kilometers of Paris, and we'll have a brief glimpse at some of the men that made it possible. If you're a fan of history and those that came before us, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thank you. The Dark Ages gained its bleak title due to the perceived loss of culture and incoming barbarity that washed over the Mediterranean and beyond after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. Those who had inherited the classical world from the Greeks now themselves watched as they became just another line on a page in the great book of history that records the acts and achievements of those civilizations confined to the embers of the past. As the Roman torch dimmed and her perceived cultural light receded back towards her capitals, the darkness that now lingered over the world would give rise to some of the greatest powers the world has ever known. As a new sun started to rise in modern-day Saudi Arabia, a new religion would be born, and another cycle of the civilizational evolutionary process would begin. Those that had dragged Rome into the Dark Age like the Visigoths and her neighbours would now be introduced to what had emerged from this self-imposed loss of centralised power. The Umayyad Caliphate was the largest empire the world had yet to lay their eyes on. It spanned 3 continents, 11 million square miles, and would push Islam into the Caucasus towards Russia in the east and all the way to the shores of the Atlantic in the west, creating an Islamic dynasty in Spain that would rule for centuries. The dawn of a new age was underway, the Age of Islam. Under the Umayyad Caliphate, Islam was growing at a devastating rate across Asia and Africa, and it was not just limited to those lands we consider Islamic today. Almost the entire Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal, was wrestled out of the hands of Christendom in the 8th century. The Islamic world was clashing with Christian forces on both sides of the Mediterranean. and during these conquests, the new kid on the block looked like it might be set to dominate Christianity in every region they met. It was this Islamic push into Europe in which we focus today, as the forces of the Umayyad Caliphates would clash with the Prince of the Franks in modern-day France, as they aimed to stretch the Caliphates and their new religion into Central Europe. The Umayyad Empire was the second caliphate established after the death of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. It ruled from 661 to 750 AD, being established 60 years after the death of the prophet. It was under the Umayyad Caliphate that Islam stretched across all of northern Africa. It is from these strongholds in Africa that our journey begins. Musa ibn Nasr was the son of a slave who had entered the service of the governor of Egypt. After impressing this son of the current caliph, Musa's father rose through the ranks quickly. Musa's early origins are uncertain. He was born in around 650 AD in Syria. Musa ibn Nasr soon displayed an ambition, devotion to God, and way of being that inspired those around him. He would be appointed co-governor of Iraq, and by the year 698 AD, he was governor of Ifriqiya, a region covering modern-day Tunisia, eastern Algeria, and Tripolitania. Within another decade, by 708 AD, he would have used smart politics and brutal strategies to wear down the final resistance of the northern Berber tribes. Musa was noted for his ability to bring different cultures and religions together. He integrated many Berbers into the caliphate and converted them to Islam, although he did not force the religion on them and had mixed populations within his armies. He is noted in Islamic history for the power he managed to exert by pulling these unlikely partners and tribes together. It is in this tribe and through Musa's political skills that we meet our next character in this tale. Tariq ibn Ziyad was a military leader and was appointed governor of Tangiers after its conquest in 711 by Musa. Tariq is the man that would launch this great Islamic invasion of Europe on behalf of his Umayyad rulers and leave his name attached to the region forever. How the invasion began is a contested subject, but most historians agree that the Umayyads were invited to Spain through one means or another. The Iberian Peninsula had been under Visigothic rule since the 6th century and the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but after a series of brutal dynastic struggles, the kingdom was weakened and had multiple claimants to the throne. As the story goes, there was one last holdout in Africa though, a vassal of the Byzantine Empire, holding a secure fortress city on the coast of northern Africa. Julian, Count of Ceuta, as he was known, paid homage to the Visigoths of Spain as had been traditional, but after sending his daughter to the Visigothic king Roderick, the monarch had his way with the young lady, taking her innocence and laying his child inside her. Julian, desperate for vengeance at this injustice, but too weak to face the king himself, made a deal with Musa to give him information, boats and a staging post to launch an invasion, telling him how the Visigothic kingdom was on the brink of collapse. And so it was that Musa ibn Nasr instructed his fierce Berber commander and warriors to undertake this great task on his behalf. In April of the year 711, Tariq's army, at least 7,000 men strong, made up of recent Berber converts to Islam, was ferried across the Straits of Gibraltar by Julian and his ships. Tariq set off from the foothills of a mountain, henceforth named Jabal Tariq, Mount of Tariq, or anglicised Jabal Tariq to Gibraltar, the name we know it as today. Roderick was ruling over a fractured kingdom and an army loyal to the sons of the previous king, those who he had deposed to gain his crown. The very ground on which he stood was ready to collapse beneath him. He had weakened an already fractured kingdom, and now he would face this new Islamic threat. The numbers involved and reasons for defeat are as varying as I have ever seen in historic accounts, from tales of 100,000 Visigothic soldiers overcome by the holy might of Islam, or a small fractured Visigothic force that never stood a chance, with tales of Roderick's allies abandoning him mid-battle to leave him to his fate. Either way, Roderick was slain on the battlefield, alongside a large number of the Visigoth nobility. They would hold out, however, in small parts of the northeastern regions, but Visigothic rule had now come to an end. After over a century's dominance, Roderick was killed in the battle, and Berber forces swept through the region with apparent ease. Tariq would capture Cordoba, Toledo, Granada and Astorga on his journey north. Islam had seemingly smashed its way into Western Europe with ease. It would remain for almost a millennia. These successes led to Musa ibn Nasr and his son coming to the region a year later with an Arab Berber force of an additional 20,000 soldiers. Tariq was relieved of his temporary governorship given by Musa, and the two continued to capture the peninsula. Within just 2 years, 70% of the region was securely under Umayyad control. The reach of Islam seemed impossible to contain. These two men, together with Musa's battle-hardened son, had conquered an entire region. Musa would be recalled to the great walled city of Damascus along with his Berber commander Tariq, on the surface to celebrate their successes and have a triumph through the gates of the city, bringing their bounty and spoils to the Umayyad Caliph Al-Walid I. In reality, Musa would be met by the new Caliph, Suleiman, viewing Musa as a rightful threat who would govern two large regions and as a man who had loyal Berber tribes and men of many faiths under his own command. Suleiman stripped him of his bounty and wealth, then kept Musa by his side rather than killing him, until the end of his life, playing the complex game of dynastic politics. Shortly after, Suleiman would order the execution and decapitation of Musa's son, who was ruling Al-Andalus on his father's behalf. The poor rationale given that he was too close to the Christian faith and was breaking the laws of Islam. The truth being, the Caliph feared Musa and his son would establish their own caliphate in Al-Andalus with the extreme power they were cultivating in the Western Empire. A sad death for a hero of the spread of the caliphate. After receiving the head of his son, Musa was a broken man, his other heir being assassinated shortly afterwards while in North Africa. He would die sad and broken while on pilgrimage. Even without Musa, his son and Tariq, Islam would continue to stretch across the region. Not being satisfied with the borders of their new kingdom, the Umayyad Caliphate now controlled both the entrance to and the heart of the Mediterranean. They set their eyes even further north. In the coming years, the Caliphate continued its push through the region, now venturing over the Pyrenees and following the Visigoths to their last holdings in Septimia. In 720, the Umayyad governor of the region of Al-Andalus pushed towards Narbonne, the Gothic capital, slaughtering the inhabitants and populating garrisons in the region. Islam was now in Gaul. In Frankfurt, however, things weren't going to be as easy. In the year 721, just a couple of years after the conquest of Narbonne, the Muslim army pushed northward into Aquitaine. At this time, the Duke of Aquitaine still held power independent of the Frankish kingdom and ruled his own domains, much to the dismay of the Franks. Odo, the great Duke of Aquitaine, had already seen one of his Berber allies be destroyed by the Caliphate as it pushed north. Odo, seeing this ever-spreading force of conquest get closer and closer to his kingdom, had gone to ask the Franks for assistance. They instead played the safe game and watched from a distance to see how much of a threat this Islamic kingdom was. Odo returned 3 months after leaving his duchy. He entered Aquitaine and headed towards Toulouse, which the Arabs had been besieging for 3 months. Since the Umayyads had been having such an easy time of it, their discipline had waned and their organisation was poor. They had an insufficient number of scouts and did not defend the sieging forces effectively. Odo swept in with his Aquitanian, Gascon and Frankish force, catching the sieging Umayyads unawares and slaughtering them against the walls of the city. At the same time, the men garrisoned within the city launched a simultaneous assault. The resulting massacre was a bloodbath. The Islamic invasion was not going to be stopped by one setback, however. A cavalry charge on an ill-prepared and surprised force was not representative of the powers at hand. Within 10 years, the Umayyads were back with a larger, more well-prepared and trained army. They smashed Odo at the Battle of the River Garonne outside Bordeaux in the year 732 AD. Latin chronicles state the Islamic army was 80,000 strong. This number does seem rather high for the location and time period, however, and as such is disputed by most historians. The Umayyad forces, while fierce in battle, were known for valuing booty and loot above discipline. They raided northern Aquitaine, its great monasteries and estates, ravaging the country as it went. They then continued their march towards Tours, a city that had gained the reputation amongst the Saracens as being highly wealthy and holding great treasures. While the Muslims had found these European armies no match compared to the style of cavalry warfare they faced in Africa and Arabia, the Islamic world was about to meet a true representation of power in Europe, not a fractured warring society or a dukedom in southern France. No, their success would now be their downfall, as they encroached into the lands held by the Prince of the Franks and the grandfather of Charlemagne, the man who would become Holy Roman Emperor. Charles Martel, or the Hammer as he was known, had been consolidating power for decades. He was a smart, religious man with a mind for politics and warfare. He had been suppressing rebelling groups, conquering new lands, and fighting civil wars since he fought for his throne as a boy. He had just crushed the Frisians and Saxons and had a well-trained and experienced army under his control that had decades of experience of war. In the year 732, the Umayyad force was moving northwards towards the Loire. Their intended target was the Abbey of St. Martin of Tours, one of the most important shrines and places of Christendom in Western Europe, and also known to hold huge amounts of wealth. As the Umayyad army approached Tours, they were surprised to see a large organised force sat in their path. Charles, being the experienced commander he was, used the foothills and forests to reach the region without being detected by scouts or raiding parties. The surprised and confused Islamic force used their cavalry to harry the Frankish flanks, expecting the force to show signs of weakness. No signs were given. The Umayyad army had no idea there was even a well-organised military force or peoples in the region. They had expected these Franks in Gaul to be much the same as the other groups the Caliphate had squashed, tribal groups that roamed the lands left by the Roman Empire. It is not believed the Caliphate was even aware of these Frankish people's existence, or the step up in competition they had just met. Charles Martel was not a tribal military leader. He kept his military in a tight formation. His units were mostly foot soldiers, as this was the style of warfare in Western and Central Europe for the most part in this time period. This would soon change with the large-scale adoption of heavy cavalry and shock tactics. But these Gallic Frankish foot soldiers were experienced in their craft. It is estimated between 20 to 40,000 men occupied each side of the battlefield, but again these numbers vary greatly. Charles chose not to engage with the Umayyad army, instead manoeuvring his troops and using the landscape to help aid the defence of his men. They stationed themselves atop hills and next to woodlands, making a potential cavalry charge from the Islamic force much less desirable. Charles continued this strategy for 7 full days, trying to entice the Umayyad army to attack, the force most likely not wishing to engage the highly armed, organised and numbersome foe, instead wishing to reach and sack the Abbey of St. Martin and Tours. But to reach it they would have to at least give battle, to disorganise or separate this Frankish force. On the 7th day the frustrated Muslims finally gave in, and the Battle of Tours or Poitiers began. They used the tactical superiority of the cavalry to charge Charles's phalanx-like infantry formation throughout the day, trying to break the line as would be typical. The well-trained Frankish force held though. They fought in a square formation with short flanks, making the cavalry pay when they did break the line and overexpose themselves. Charles had outmaneuvered the Islamic force and now had them where he wanted them. The Franks were the most elite force the Caliphate had faced in this invasion of Western Europe. They used the topography and their organisation to confuse and exhaust the chargers, before turning the tables on the aggressors and forcing them back. As this happened, mass disarray broke out in Abdul al-Rahman's troops. Panic and screams broke out. Men ran for their lives. The source of this added panic was hard to place at first, but it soon became apparent. The great Aquitanian Duke Odo had smashed into the rear of the Arabic force, targeting their loot, supplies and families. The Franks slaughtered the infantry they could catch and destroyed the camp. Charles would follow them south, beating them in battle after battle over the coming months, allying with the Lombard king and driving them out of the entire region in the following years. These battles between Dark Age Christianity and Islam in the forests and foothills of Gaul are an unexpected interaction when first delving into our past. The results of Charles Martel and his fierce defence of his faith and lands could be characterised as some of the most important in European history, a tipping point between large-scale spread and adoption of Islam compared to the centralisation of the great Christian states in Europe that Charles and his ancestors would bring. To give some scale and some further insight, I would like to end with some notes from the 18th century historian Edward Gibbons. A victorious line of march had been prolonged above 1,000 miles from the Rock of Gibraltar to the banks of the Loire. The repetition of an equal space would have carried the Saracens to the confines of Poland and the highlands of Scotland. The Rhine is not more impassable than the Nile or Euphrates, and the Arabian fleet might have sailed without naval combat into the mouth of the Thames. Perhaps the interpretation of the Quran would now be taught in the schools of Oxford." End quote. As far-fetched as it might sound, this event in modern-day France could have had a larger impact on European history than any other battle. It is hard to believe in Dark Age history that an Islamic army was just 200 kilometers from Paris and almost established a cross-sea empire from the Atlantic back to Arabia and beyond. The wonder of those who walked the earth before us truly has no bounds. And so today we take our steps through the sand of life, wondering one day how historians will discern our cultural footsteps in this great history of our species.